He smiled casually and said, "This is Hannah. She helps keep my place clean." A few people laughed. Someone nodded approvingly. Cameras flashed. Hannah stood beside him in a simple cream dress, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression calm, too calm. Then the ballroom doors opened. The billionaire CEO stepped inside, scanned the room, locked eyes with Hannah, and said one sentence that drained the color from Jonathan Reed's face. Because the cleaner he had just humiliated was about to take the stage, and everything he had built his image on was about to collapse in public. But let's rewind. To understand how we got here, we need to go back 1 week. Jonathan Reed sat at his desk in his modest Midtown office, staring at the embossed invitation glowing on his screen. Caldwell Global, Black Tie Gala, invitation only. His pulse quickened. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee mug, missing it on the first try. This was it. 10 years of late nights, forced laughter at jokes that weren't funny, endless performances pretending to be someone he wasn't quite sure he'd become. 10 years of being almost enough, almost respected, almost included, almost one of them. An invitation to Richard Caldwell's annual gala meant something had finally shifted. He was being seen. And in Jonathan's carefully constructed world, where image was currency and perception was power, being seen by the right people was everything. "Hannah," he called out, his voice echoing through their comfortable apartment. The scent of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. Classical music played softly Chopin, something elegant she'd chosen. She appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, her expression open and warm, the same look she'd given him on their first date 7 years ago. "Yes, honey." Jonathan turned his laptop toward her, unable to contain his grin. "Look at this. The Caldwell Gala. They invited me. Do you understand what this means?" She smiled, genuinely happy for him. "It means they recognize your hard work." He nodded, but the correction came quickly. "It means I'm finally being seen, Hannah, by the people who matter. The people who decide careers." He stopped himself, realizing he was talking too fast. "This changes everything." She moved closer, studying the elegant invitation designed gold lettering against cream stock, Art Deco borders that whispered old money and exclusivity. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I suppose you'll need a tuxedo." "And you'll come with me," he added, already envisioning the night. "It's a couples event. Everyone brings their wives." Hannah blinked. "Me?" "Of course." He reached for his coffee, taking a casual sip that masked his sudden nervousness. "But, let's keep things simple. You know how these corporate types are. I don't want to seem out of place." She tilted her head slightly. "Out of place how?" He sighed, setting the mug down. "You know what I mean. Just something understated. Modest. You always look best when you keep things low-key." Her chest tightened. Over the years, Hannah had learned to translate Jonathan's language with precision. Modest meant don't embarrass me. Simple meant don't compete with my image. Low-key meant smaller than me, always. "All right," she said quietly. "Something simple." As she turned to leave, Jonathan's voice followed her, casual but weighted. "And Hannah, when we get there, if anyone asks, just go along with however I introduce you. Some of these people are old money. I can't explain our entire situation in one night. It's complicated." Her steps slowed. "Introduce me how?" He waved dismissively, eyes already drifting back to his screen. "Nothing serious. Maybe I'll say you help with things at home, just until they get to know me better. It's corporate etiquette." Hannah turned fully now. "You mean tell people I'm your housekeeper?" Jonathan's face hardened slightly. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Don't make it sound dramatic. These people judge everything, your shoes, your watch, your story. You wouldn't understand how cutthroat these circles are." Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed calm. "I understand respect, Jonathan, and pretending I'm your employee doesn't sound like respect." He exhaled impatiently, standing up. "Can you not make this a thing? It's one night of playing it safe while I secure our future. Once I get this promotion, everything changes." Her silence filled the space between them. The music seemed to quiet. Finally, she nodded. "If that's what you need." Relief washed over his face. He smiled, stepping closer to kiss her forehead. "That's my girl. You've always understood me better than anyone." But as he returned to his laptop, Already lost in fantasies of handshakes and promotions, he didn't see the way Hannah's jaw tightened. He didn't notice how her shoulders squared slightly, or how her eyes had shifted not with anger, but with something quieter and far more dangerous. Awareness. Later that night, Hannah lay awake beside him. Jonathan's breathing was steady and deep, the sound of someone dreaming without worry. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about how easily he'd said it, how small he'd made her sound, how thoroughly he'd convinced himself it was reasonable. Once Jonathan had loved her simplicity. He'd told her it grounded him. Now that same simplicity seemed to embarrass him, as if she were evidence of a life he was trying to outgrow. She thought about the invitation still glowing on his laptop. She thought about Richard Caldwell's name printed in elegant script at the bottom. And she thought about something Jonathan had forgotten entirely. Hannah whispered into the darkness. "You'll see me one day, Jonathan. Really see me." But he was already deep in dreams, dreams of chandeliers and applause, of handshakes that meant arrival, of a version of himself that didn't need her to be small, to feel big. He dreamed of being seen. She lay awake, knowing she already was. By people who mattered far more than he realized. Jonathan Reed wasn't born insecure. Insecurity was something he learned, brick by careful brick, over years of being almost enough. He grew up in a middle-class suburb of Philadelphia, where comfort was abundant but distinction was rare. His father was an accountant. His mother taught elementary school. They were good people who worked hard and never caused trouble. They were, in every measurable way, fine. And that was the problem. Jonathan had always wanted more than fine. He wanted remarkable. He wanted the kind of presence that made people remember your name. He wanted to walk into rooms and have conversations, pause. At 17, he'd stood in his high school gymnasium during a career fair, staring at a recruiter from an elite financial firm. The man wore a suit that probably cost more than Jonathan's father made in a month. He spoke about Manhattan, about deals that moved markets, about a life where your decisions mattered. "We only hire the best," the recruiter had said. Jonathan had smiled back and thought, "I'll be the best then." That promise had defined the next 20 years. He'd worked his way through a state university, graduated with honors but without connections, the kind of Ivy League network that opened doors before you even knocked. He'd spent 2 years in a soul-crushing entry-level position, watching Ivy League graduates get promoted over him simply because they'd summered with the right families. When Caldwell Global finally hired him at 31, it felt like salvation. But breaching walls and belonging inside them were two different things. At Caldwell Global, Jonathan learned that competence wasn't enough. You had to perform competence with the right accent, the right references, the right ease. You had to make million-dollar decisions sound casual. So Jonathan learned to perform. He forced laughter at jokes he didn't find funny. He bought a watch he couldn't afford because a senior partner had commented on timepieces. He started saying summer as a verb. And slowly, painfully, it started to work. People began, including him. His opinions were solicited. Partners remembered his name. He was becoming visible not for who he was, but for who he was learning to pretend to be. The problem was that the performance never ended. He met Hannah during this transformation, at a charity event he'd attended for networking. She'd been volunteering, organizing the silent auction, while everyone else was performing, talking loudly. Name-dropping. Hannah had simply been present, calm, genuine. He'd fallen in love with that genuineness. It had felt like relief. In those early years, he'd told her everything, his fears, his insecurities, his exhaustion at constantly performing. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she'd said once. "I already see you." Those words had meant everything. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. As Jonathan climbed higher, as he got closer to the rooms where real power lived, Hannah's genuineness began to feel less like relief and more like evidence. Evidence that he'd come from somewhere unremarkable. Evidence that he wasn't born into this world but was faking his way through it. Her simplicity, which he'd once loved, now felt like a mirror reflecting everything he was trying to transcend. He never said this out loud, but it lived in the small comments, the subtle redirections, the way he'd stopped bringing her to company events. "It's just a boring work thing." You'd hated all corporate talk. Hannah never pushed. She simply nodded, which somehow made him feel worse. But the gala invitation changed everything. This was Richard Caldwell's personal gala where futures were decided, where promotions were whispered about over champagne, and everyone brought their wives. which meant he needed Hannah there. But he needed a version of Hannah that fit the narrative he'd been building, the narrative where everything about his life suggested he belonged. The week before the gala, Jonathan bought a new tuxedo. He stood in the upscale men's store while a tailor marked the fabric with chalk. "Big event?" the salesman asked. "The Caldwell Global Gala," Jonathan said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. The salesman's eyebrows rose. "Very nice. You'll make quite an impression." That's the plan, Jonathan thought. He practiced introductions in the mirror when Hannah wasn't watching. He rehearsed handshakes, adjusted his posture, tested different versions of his smile. He researched Richard Caldwell's career, memorizing talking points. Hannah observed quietly. She ironed his shirts without being asked. She picked up his shoes from the repair shop. One evening she asked, "What should I wear?" Jonathan barely looked up from his laptop. "Something decent. Maybe that cream dress from your cousin's wedding." "The simple one?" "Exactly. Simple, clean, elegant." He glanced at her briefly. "You always look best when you're not trying too hard." Hannah nodded and walked away, and Jonathan returned to his research, completely missing the way her hands had tightened. The night before the gala, Hannah stood in their bedroom holding two dresses. One was the cream dress Jonathan had suggested, modest, understated, nearly invisible. The other was a deep blue dress she'd bought years ago, before Jonathan had started editing her choices. She looked at both for a long time. Then she hung the blue dress back and laid the cream one on the chair. Jonathan came in as she was closing the closet. He saw the cream dress and nodded approvingly. "Perfect choice. Exactly right." He kissed her cheek, already mentally at the gala, already shaking Richard Caldwell's hand in his imagination. Hannah watched him leave. She thought about the conversation from a week ago, the one where he'd asked her to pretend to be his housekeeper, where he'd looked at her, his wife, his partner, and decided she needed to be smaller so he could appear bigger. She thought about the word he'd used, strategy, as if love were a game, as if she were a piece to be positioned. Jonathan didn't notice her standing in the doorway. He didn't see the way her expression had shifted from hurt to something else entirely, something quiet and patient and profoundly powerful. He saw what he'd always seen, Hannah. Simple, agreeable Hannah who would go along with whatever he needed. He had no idea who she really was. But tomorrow night, he would learn. The night of the gala arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, gentle breeze, temperatures that allowed formal wear without discomfort. Jonathan stood in front of their bedroom mirror, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. The tuxedo fit perfectly. He looked, he had to admit, impressive. Behind him, Hannah emerged from the bathroom in the cream dress. It fell to just below her knees, elegant in its simplicity. She'd styled her dark hair in soft waves, applied minimal makeup, chosen small gold earrings. She looked beautiful. Jonathan looked her over with an evaluating gaze. "Not bad," he said, turning back to his reflection. "Simple, clean, exactly right." "Thank you," Hannah said quietly. "We should leave in 10 minutes. I want to arrive fashionably on time, not early, not late." He'd calculated everything. The drive from their Queens apartment into Manhattan took 45 minutes. Jonathan drove with focused precision, occasionally rehearsing phrases under his breath. "Richard, I've been following the Sustainable Development Initiative with great interest." The Parker acquisition was brilliant strategy. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, watching the city slide past her window. The skyline glittered in the distance. She'd grown up in this city, walked these streets, knew these buildings in ways Jonathan never would. But he didn't ask about her silence. They arrived at the Metropolitan Club precisely on time. The building was a Gilded Age masterpiece, Renaissance architecture, imposing columns. A red carpet extended from the entrance. Photographers clustered near the door. Jonathan's heart hammered with excitement. "Remember," he whispered, "smile. Be polite, don't draw attention. Just blend." Hannah nodded. A valet opened Jonathan's door. Jonathan stepped out first, pausing to button his jacket, to assume the posture of someone who belonged. Then he offered his hand to help Hannah out. Cameras flashed. Jonathan's pulse quickened with exhilaration. Hannah's remained steady, calm, controlled. As they reached the door, a colleague from his department, Marcus Chen, a senior associate, spotted him. "Jonathan," Marcus called out. "You made it." Jonathan's face lit up. He moved toward Marcus quickly. Hannah followed a step behind. Marcus, good to see you, Jonathan said, shaking his hand firmly. Big night. The biggest, Marcus agreed. Then his eyes shifted to Hannah. And who's this? Jonathan's smile didn't waver, but something in his posture shifted a subtle tension. This is Hannah, he said casually. She helps manage things at home, keeps everything running smoothly. The words hung in the air. Marcus blinked. Oh, I see. He looked at Hannah again, this time with different eyes. Nice to meet you, Hannah. You as well, Hannah replied, her voice calm. But inside, something cracked. Just a hairline fracture. But there. They moved inside, and the ballroom stole whatever thoughts might have followed. It was magnificent. Gold leaf covered the vaulted ceiling. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars hung from chains. The floor was polished marble that reflected everything like still water. Round tables dressed in white linen circled a central dance floor. Along one wall, a string quartet played. Along another, bars had been set up. Waiters in black tie moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. And everywhere was wealth. Not just money, but the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Men in tuxedos that cost 5 figures. Women in gowns that required appointments at exclusive boutiques. This was the world Jonathan had been chasing for a decade. His confidence inflated instantly, his shoulders rolled back, his smile widened. He seemed to grow taller simply by being in this room. Let's get drinks, he said. He moved through the crowd with purpose. Hannah followed behind, not beside him, behind, half a step back. At the bar, Jonathan ordered a scotch for himself and white wine for Hannah without asking her preference. Here, he said, handing her the glass. Then, stay close, but give me space to network. Hannah took the wine and nodded. Jonathan turned immediately, scanning the room like a hunter looking for prey. He spotted a group of senior executives near the tall windows. Wait here, he told Hannah. I'll be back. And he was gone, leaving Hannah standing alone at the bar. She took a small sip of wine she didn't want and watched him go. Watched him laugh too loudly. Watched him gesture expansively. Watched him transform into a version of himself that seemed both more and less than who he really was. Around her, the gala continued. Hannah stood very still, her expression calm. But inside, that hairline crack was spreading. Across the room, Jonathan was introducing himself to a vice president, beginning his rehearsed pitch. He didn't look back at Hannah. Not once. He didn't see the way a few people glanced at her with curiosity. He didn't see the way she met those glances calmly. He didn't see the way one particular executive, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a sharp gaze, paused to study Hannah for a long moment before whispering something to the person beside her. Jonathan didn't see any of it, because he was too busy trying to be seen himself. And in his blindness, he'd made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed the woman standing alone at the bar was someone small, someone who needed his permission to matter. He was wrong. Devastatingly, publicly, irrevocably wrong. The moment arrived 90 minutes into the gala, when the champagne had flowed long enough to loosen inhibitions, but not long enough to create problems. The sweet spot of corporate socialization. Jonathan had been working the room with persistence, moving from group to group. He'd name-dropped successfully twice, made 3 senior executives laugh, and secured contact information from a vice president. He felt invincible, which is always when gravity reasserts itself. He was standing near one of the massive windows when someone new joined the circle. Gerald Winters, a director who'd been with Caldwell Global since its founding. Gerald had the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to prove himself. Jonathan, Gerald said warmly, good to see you here. Mr. Winters, Jonathan replied, honored to be invited. Well, you've been doing solid work on the Riverside development, Gerald said, and Jonathan felt his chest expand. Strategic thinking, good instincts. This was it. This was the conversation that could change everything. They talked business for several minutes. Jonathan was articulate, informed, careful to demonstrate competence without arrogance. He was nailing it. Then Gerald's eyes drifted past Jonathan's shoulder. And who's that lovely woman who came in with you? Jonathan turned. Hannah was standing about 15 feet away, near a high-top table, speaking with an older woman. She looked composed, elegant, completely at ease. For a split second, something flickered across Jonathan's face. Calculation, decision-making, choosing what story to tell. And then he smiled. Casual. Easy. Oh, that's Hannah, She helps keep my place clean. The words came out smoothly, like they'd been rehearsed, like they weren't a betrayal wrapped in a smile. Gerald blinked. Your housekeeper? Yeah, Jonathan continued. She's been with me for a few years. Very reliable. I told her she should come experience something like this, figured it would be interesting for her. Around them, the other men exchanged glances. Someone coughed quietly. Gerald's expression shifted subtly from warmth to something more guarded. That's generous of you. I'm a generous guy, Jonathan said, trying to inject humor. Someone laughed, a social laugh, the kind that fills awkward spaces. Across the room, Hannah's conversation paused. The woman she'd been speaking with, Catherine Morrison, glanced toward the group of men, her expression sharpening. Hannah's face remained perfectly calm, but her hands, holding a champagne flute, tightened imperceptibly. Jonathan didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the way the tension had broken, the way he'd successfully navigated what could have been awkward by making Hannah smaller. It had worked. He felt safer, more comfortable. By reducing her, he'd protected himself. It was warped mathematics, but in that moment, it felt like success. The conversation continued. Someone made a joke about domestic help in the city. The topic drifted to real estate, to vacation homes. Jonathan participated eagerly, laughing at the right moments. He didn't see Gerald Winters glance toward Hannah again, his expression troubled. He didn't see Catherine Morrison lean closer to Hannah and say something quietly, her hand briefly touching Hannah's arm. He didn't see the way several other people had paused, having overheard his introduction, their faces showing confusion and disapproval. What he did see was a room full of successful people, and himself among them, not on the outside looking in, but actually finally belonging, or so he thought. 20 minutes later, Jonathan excused himself to use the restroom. As he walked across the ballroom, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. He'd handled the evening perfectly. In the marble-clad bathroom, he stood in front of the mirror, straightening his bow tie. His reflection looked exactly like he'd always wanted, polished, successful, worthy. He didn't know that at that same moment, Hannah was standing in front of a different mirror in the women's lounge. She stood perfectly still, her hands braced against the marble counter, breathing deeply and carefully. Around her, the lounge was empty. Her expression was unreadable. Not broken, Hannah was far too strong to break over words, but changed. The hairline crack was now a visible fault line. She thought about 7 years of marriage, 7 years of supporting Jonathan's ambitions, holding him through his insecurities, believing in him when he doubted himself. And tonight, in a room full of strangers, he'd reduced all of that to, she helps keep my place clean. Not, this is my wife. Not even, this is Hannah, my partner. Just, she helps keep my place clean. As if she were a service he'd purchased. As if her presence required explanation. As if being associated with her, honestly, might diminish him somehow. Hannah looked at herself in the mirror, at the woman in the modest cream dress, with a calm expression that had been carefully maintained all evening. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to feel the full weight. Not anger. Anger was hot and reactive and temporary. This was something colder. Something that had been building slowly over months and years. Something that crystallized in this bathroom, under these lights. Awareness. Complete, undeniable, transformative awareness of who her husband had become. She straightened slowly. She smoothed her dress, checked her reflection, and allowed herself one single moment of private truth. You don't know me at all, Jonathan. You never asked. And now you'll learn. Then she fixed her expression back to calm composure, took one deep breath, and walked back out into the gala, where she would wait, with infinite patience, for the moment when everything Jonathan thought he'd built would come crashing down. Because the woman he'd just humiliated wasn't a cleaner. She was something else entirely. Something he was about to discover in the most public way possible. After the bathroom mirror moment, Hannah returned to the ballroom with a different energy. Not visible, she was too controlled for that, but internal. A shift from enduring to observing. She found a position near one of the tall windows, away from the main clusters but not isolated. What she didn't realize was that she'd already been noticed. Catherine Morrison, the silver-haired executive who'd been speaking with Hannah earlier, had watched the cleaner introduction unfold with barely concealed disgust. Catherine had spent 40 years in corporate America, fighting her way into rooms that didn't want women, and she recognized dismissal when she saw it. Catherine approached Hannah with 2 fresh champagne flutes. You look like you could use this. Hannah accepted with a grateful smile. Thank you. That's kind. Not kind, Catherine corrected. Strategic. I hate drinking alone, and everyone here bores me except you. Hannah laughed, a real laugh that surprised her. I'm not sure what about me is interesting. According to Jonathan, I'm just here to observe. Catherine's eyebrow arched. Jonathan? The man who introduced you as his housekeeper? Hannah's smile didn't waver, but her eyes shifted. You heard that. Everyone heard that, Catherine said bluntly. Sound carries in marble ballrooms, and insecure men tend to speak louder than they realize. She paused. I assume you're not actually his housekeeper? Hannah took a sip of champagne. I clean his apartment sometimes, she said carefully. Among other things. It wasn't a lie. Just a frame that didn't include the part about them sharing that apartment as husband and wife. Catherine studied her with sharp eyes. You speak very carefully, like someone who's used to being underestimated. Or someone who's learned that people see what they expect to see, Hannah replied. And what do people expect to see when they look at you? Hannah's smile turned slightly sad. Someone simple, someone small, someone who helps. And what should they see? For a moment, Hannah didn't answer. Then she said quietly, someone who understands this world better than they think. Before Catherine could respond, a voice joined their conversation. Hannah? They both turned. A man in his 60s, distinguished with silver temples and warm brown eyes, approached with a smile of genuine delight. Professor Chen, Hannah said, her whole demeanor brightening. I didn't know you'd be here. Richard always invites me to these things, Professor Chen replied, embracing her warmly. But I'm more surprised to see you. Catherine's eyes sharpened with interest. I am, Hannah said. I'm here with someone. Professor Chen caught the hesitation. Someone who appreciates having you here, I hope? Hannah's smile was diplomatic. Someone who's trying to make an impression? Well, they should be letting you make the impression, Professor Chen said. Catherine, have you met Hannah Caldwell, one of my best graduate students before she decided economics was more interesting than academic theory? Catherine's expression transformed. Caldwell? She repeated slowly, as in, Richard's niece, Professor Chen confirmed, though she prefers not to trade on the family name. Hannah shot him a look that was half gratitude, half warning. Professor, don't professor me, he said warmly. You published 2 papers still being cited in behavioral economics circles. You consulted on 3 major urban development projects. You could be teaching at Columbia right now. Don't pretend you're just here as someone's +1. Across the room, Jonathan was deep in conversation, completely unaware that his cleaner was being recognized by a Columbia economics professor and a senior executive who sat on Caldwell Global's strategic advisory board. I'd appreciate if we kept that quiet tonight, Hannah said carefully. The family connection. It tends to change conversations. Catherine's laugh was short and sharp. I bet it does, especially for men who introduce you as their domestic help. Professor Chen's expression shifted to confusion. He did what? Nothing, Hannah said quickly. It's complicated. Complicated, Catherine repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of that word. Before Hannah could respond, another voice joined them. Hannah, I thought that was you. A woman in her 40s, elegant in a navy gown, approached with a warm smile. Lydia Chen, Professor Chen's daughter. We met at the Columbia Symposium last year. Of course, Hannah said. You presented on sustainable urban infrastructure. It was brilliant. Not as brilliant as your questions afterward, Lydia replied. You identified the weakness in my funding model in about 3 sentences. She turned to Catherine. Are you monopolizing the smartest person in the room? Catherine's smile was sharp. I'm trying to understand why she's hiding that fact. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Hannah found herself drawn into discussions about development economics, housing policy, and market trends. She spoke carefully at first, but as the conversation deepened, her natural intelligence became impossible to hide. She referenced recent papers. She challenged assumptions. She offered insights from years of study. Professor Chen beamed. Lydia took notes. Catherine watched with the expression of someone mentally recalculating everything. Other executives began drifting toward their conversation. Hannah's quiet voice had more authority than most of the loud men filling the room. Across the ballroom, Jonathan finally noticed the cluster forming around Hannah. His stomach dropped. He'd told her not to draw attention. He'd told her to blend in. And there she was, surrounded by people, clearly the center of conversation. He excused himself and made his way toward her, his jaw tight with irritation. "Hannah," he said, his voice friendly but with an edge only she would recognize. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She turned. "Of course. Jonathan, this is—" "We can do introductions later," he interrupted, his hand finding her elbow. "Excuse us." He guided her away toward a quieter corner. Hannah didn't resist, but her body language had gone very still. "What are you doing?" Jonathan asked in a low voice. "Having a conversation," Hannah replied evenly. "I asked you not to draw attention." "I didn't. They approached me." "Well, you could have kept it brief," he said, frustration poorly disguised. "This is important for me, Hannah. I need people focused on my contributions, not distracted." Hannah studied his face. Distracted by what? By. He caught himself. "Just keep it low-key, please. For me?" Before she could respond, he spotted someone he wanted to talk to. "I need to catch Richard's partner before he leaves. Stay here. I'll be back in 10 minutes." And he was gone. Hannah stood alone near the coat room, her champagne flute still half full. A waiter passed by. Without thinking, Jonathan called out to him, then gestured toward Hannah. "Could you refresh her drink?" he said casually. "Thanks." The dismissiveness of it, treating her like part of the staff, landed like a slap. The waiter looked uncomfortable. Hannah smiled graciously. "Actually, I'm fine, thank you." But something had broken. Hannah walked slowly back toward the windows, away from the crowd. She looked out at Fifth Avenue below, at the city lights stretching into the distance. Somewhere in this city was the woman she'd been before she met Jonathan. The woman who'd graduated top of her class, who'd published research that professors still cited, who'd turned down teaching positions because she wanted to work in the field. That woman had been confident, had been seen for who she was. Hannah hadn't thought about that woman in years. She'd let herself become smaller, not all at once, that's never how it happens, but in increments, in tiny compromises, in moments when staying quiet was easier than fighting. She'd told herself it was partnership, that relationships required sacrifice. But what she'd learned tonight, standing in this ballroom, while her husband introduced her as his cleaner, and then ordered waiters to refresh her drink, was that there's a difference between sacrifice and erasure. And she'd been erased. By his words, by his choices, by her own willingness to become whatever he needed her to be. But here's what Jonathan didn't understand. You can erase someone's title. You can dismiss their accomplishments. You can introduce them as something they're not. But you can't erase who they actually are. Hannah Caldwell Reed wasn't small because Jonathan needed her to be. She was patient, strategic, waiting for the right moment. And across the ballroom, the doors were opening. Richard Caldwell was arriving. And everything Jonathan thought he'd successfully managed was about to detonate. Hannah took one last look at her reflection in the dark window glass. Then she turned toward the ballroom entrance and waited. The shift in the room was subtle at first, a change in air pressure, a collective straightening of spines, a slight drop in the ambient noise level. Then the whispers began. "He's here. Caldwell just arrived." Jonathan's head snapped toward the main doors, so fast he nearly spilled his drink. Richard Caldwell stood in the entrance like a man who'd never questioned his right to any space he occupied. At 68, he was compact but commanding 5'9" of controlled power in an impeccable midnight blue tuxedo. Silver hair brushed back from a face that held surprising warmth. Brown eyes that missed nothing scanned the ballroom. This was the man who'd built Caldwell Global from a single property development into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The man whose approval could make careers, whose disapproval could end them. The room's social hierarchy suddenly crystallized. People positioned themselves strategically close enough to be noticed, not so close as to seem desperate. The truly powerful remained where they were. The ambitious began migrating toward his position. Jonathan was in the second category, though he desperately wanted to be in the first. "I need to," he started, already moving, but Gerald Winters caught his arm. "Give him a moment," Gerald advised quietly. "Richard likes to survey the room first, hates being ambushed." Jonathan nodded, forcing himself to stay still even as his pulse hammered. This was it. If he could get 30 seconds with Richard Caldwell, if he could make an impression, his thoughts stuttered to a halt. Because Richard Caldwell, after that initial survey, had locked eyes with someone, and that someone was Hannah. She stood near the windows, her cream dress catching the light, her expression calm and unsurprised. And as Richard Caldwell's face broke into a warm, genuine smile, the kind of smile Jonathan had been hoping to earn all evening, Hannah smiled back. Not a polite smile, a real one. Richard began moving through the crowd, and the sea of people parted automatically. Not because anyone consciously decided to move, but because his trajectory was so clear that bodies simply made way. He was walking directly toward Hannah. Jonathan's stomach dropped. "Who's he going to?" someone nearby asked. "The woman by the windows," someone else replied. "I don't know. But Richard clearly does." Jonathan pushed through the crowd, no longer caring about appearing desperate. He just needed to get there, to intercept, to manage whatever was about to happen. But he was too slow, caught in the currents of people trying to position themselves in Caldwell's orbit. Richard reached Hannah first. "Hannah," he said warmly, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet space. Hannah set down her champagne flute and stepped forward. "Good evening, Uncle Richard." The words dropped into the ballroom, like a stone into still water. Ripples of reaction spread outward, heads turning, eyes widening, conversation stopping entirely. "Uncle Richard." Jonathan froze mid-step, the room tilting sideways. "Uncle Richard." The words didn't make sense. Because Hannah was his wife who'd grown up in New Jersey, his wife who was simple, uncomplicated, unremarkable. His wife who was apparently Richard Caldwell's niece. "You came," Richard was saying, taking both of Hannah's hands. "I wasn't sure you would. You've been avoiding these events for years." "Someone convinced me it might be worth attending," Hannah replied, her tone carrying something Jonathan had never heard before, an ease, a sense of complete belonging. "Well, I'm grateful they did," Richard said. "Though I'm surprised you didn't mention you were coming. I would have made sure you were seated at our table." "I wasn't sure myself until the last minute," Hannah said. The lie was smooth, practiced, designed to protect something Jonathan didn't yet understand. Around them, the whispers had started in earnest. "That's his niece? I didn't know Richard had a niece. Someone said she's with that junior associate Reed, I think?" "No. Someone said he introduced her as his housekeeper." "His what?" The last exchange was loud enough for several people to hear. The collective attention of nearby groups shifted from curiosity to something sharper. Confusion mixed with dawning comprehension, mixed with second-hand embarrassment. Jonathan finally reached them, his face pale, his carefully constructed composure cracking at every edge. "Mr. Caldwell," he managed. "Jonathan Reed, from the Riverside Development Team. It's an honor to—" "Reed," Richard said, his tone noticeably cooler. His eyes, those brown eyes that missed nothing, studied Jonathan with the kind of attention that felt like being x-rayed. "You came with Hannah?" It wasn't really a question, it was a clarification. "Yes, sir," Jonathan said, his mind racing. "How do you two know each other?" Richard asked, and the question was deceptively casual, the kind of trap disguised as polite interest. Hannah answered before Jonathan could. "We're married, Uncle Richard." The second bomb detonated. If the first revelation had caused ripples, this one caused waves. People were no longer pretending not to listen. They were openly staring now. Richard's eyebrows rose. "Married?" He looked at Jonathan again, his evaluation now making perfect sense. This wasn't a junior associate he was meeting casually. This was his niece's husband. "Hannah, you didn't mention you'd gotten married." "It was quiet," Hannah said. "A few years ago. We've kept it private." "Private," Richard repeated, and something in his tone suggested he found that word inadequate. His attention shifted back to Jonathan. "Mr. Reed, I understand you're on the Riverside team?" "Yes, sir," Jonathan said, his throat tight. "I've been working closely on the development strategies." "And how long have you been with the company?" "Nearly 10 years. 10 years, Richard said thoughtfully. "And you're still on development teams." It wasn't a question, it was an observation. A noting of the fact that in a decade, Jonathan hadn't climbed as high as he'd wanted. The subtle cruelty of the comment landed precisely. Around them, several executives looked away. "I've been building expertise," Jonathan said. desperation creeping into his voice. "Of course," Richard said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. He turned back to Hannah, his warmth returning instantly. "We need to catch up properly. Come find me after the speeches." Richard squeezed her hand once more, then turned to address the broader room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll find your seats, we'll be starting shortly." As he walked away toward the stage, the whispers exploded into full conversation. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Around him, people were looking at him differently now. Not with respect, but with confusion, pity, and something worse: judgment. Catherine Morrison appeared at Hannah's elbow. "Well," she said dryly, "that was illuminating." Professor Chen joined them. "Hannah, I think some explanations might be helpful." Hannah's smile was gracious but tired. "Later, perhaps. I believe Uncle Richard is about to speak." As people moved toward their tables, Hannah remained standing by the windows. Jonathan stood beside her, but they might as well have been on different planets. "Hannah," he whispered urgently, aware of the dozens of eyes still on them. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Not now," she said quietly, her voice calm but final. "He's about to introduce the evening's program." On the stage, Richard Caldwell was approaching the microphone, his presence commanding immediate silence. Jonathan's hands were shaking. His carefully planned evening had detonated. The people he'd been trying to impress were now looking at him like he was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. And Hannah, his wife, his partner, the woman he'd introduced as his cleaner, was standing beside him like a stranger. Richard's voice filled the ballroom. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 20th Annual Caldwell Global Gala. Tonight, we celebrate not just our company's success, but the people whose vision and dedication make that success possible." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on Hannah. "This year, I have a special announcement to make about leadership, about the future of our strategic initiatives, and about someone whose contributions have been invaluable, even though most of you don't know her name yet." Jonathan's blood turned to ice. "No." Richard smiled, and it was the kind of smile that came before revelation. "It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's program host, a woman who's been advising on some of our most significant developments. A woman whose research has shaped our approach to sustainable urban growth. A woman I'm proud to call my niece." The room held its breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, Hannah Caldwell Reed." And the world Jonathan had built, the image, the performance, the carefully constructed facade shattered into pieces so small they could never be reassembled. For 3 seconds, the ballroom existed in perfect silence. Then the applause began. Not polite, obligatory applause. Real applause. The kind that started with a few people and built into a wave as recognition spread. Hannah stood very still. Then she turned to look at Jonathan, one last look before everything changed. His face was ashen, his mouth hung slightly open. His eyes were wide with shock, horror, and dawning comprehension. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Then she walked toward the stage. The crowd parted for her the way it had for Richard, automatically, respectfully, creating a clear path. As she moved through the ballroom, people who'd ignored her all evening now watched with fascination. People who'd dismissed her when Jonathan introduced her as his cleaner were now reassessing everything. Catherine Morrison caught her eye and nodded with vindication. Professor Chen smiled with obvious pride. Lydia mouthed, "You're amazing." Hannah climbed the 3 steps to the stage with steady grace. Richard met her there, embracing her warmly before stepping aside to give her the microphone. She stood at the podium, looking out at 300 people, and took one measured breath. When she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Hannah Caldwell Reed, and I'd like to start with an apology." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. "I've spent the last several years working behind the scenes, consulting on development projects, conducting research, advising on strategy. I've preferred anonymity, preferred letting the work speak instead of attaching my name to it." She paused. "But tonight, I realize that preference has had unintended consequences." Her eyes found Jonathan in the crowd. He stood frozen near their table, looking like a man watching his own execution. Anonymity creates space for misunderstanding, for assumptions, for people to decide who you are based on incomplete information. Her tone wasn't accusatory, it was observational, which somehow made it more devastating. And sometimes, the people closest to you make the most significant assumptions. Around the room, understanding was dawning. People were putting pieces together: the cleaner introduction, the lack of recognition, the way she'd been dismissed all evening. Tonight was supposed to celebrate the work Caldwell Global does, but I want to talk about a different kind of foundation, the one we build in our personal lives, in our relationships. She had the entire room's attention now. True power, she said slowly, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require diminishing others to appear larger. She paused, letting that sink in. And respect, real respect, isn't something you earn through proximity to power. It's something you practice in private, when no one's watching, with the people who have no ability to advance your career. The silence was absolute. My uncle built this company on principles of integrity and vision, but companies are made of people. And people bring their insecurities, their fears, their need for validation into these spaces. Her eyes swept the room. We've all done it. We've all made ourselves look better by making someone else look smaller. We've all chosen image over authenticity when the stakes felt high enough. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. But here's what I've learned working on development projects. Foundations matter. If the foundation is flawed, if it's built on deception or insecurity, or the need to appear rather than be, eventually, the structure collapses. She gripped the podium slightly. Buildings, careers, relationships. The same principle applies. Hannah's voice softened but somehow became more powerful. Tonight I was introduced to many of you as someone's cleaner, as domestic help. A few people gasped. Others looked scandalized. And I let it happen. I stayed quiet, because I wanted to see something. Richard's expression had shifted to something more complex: recognition, perhaps, of a lesson being delivered. I wanted to see if the person who made that choice would notice my discomfort, would care about my dignity, would see me as someone deserving of honesty and respect, regardless of whether it benefited them. She paused. They didn't. Jonathan's face had gone from white to gray. People were looking at him now, quick glances, curiosity mixed with judgment. So let me be clear about who I am. I have a master's degree in urban economics from Columbia. I've published research on sustainable development that's been cited in 17 academic papers. I've consulted on 3 major projects in this city, including the Riverside development some of you have been working on. Her voice remained steady, factual. I'm Richard Caldwell's niece. But more importantly, I'm someone who spent years studying how communities are built, how resources are allocated, how power operates in systems designed to concentrate it at the top. She looked directly at Jonathan now. And I'm someone who believed that love and partnership meant supporting someone else's dreams, even when it meant minimizing my own. I was wrong about that. The admission hung in the air. Support shouldn't require erasure. Partnership shouldn't demand that one person becomes smaller so the other can feel bigger. And real love respects the person you're with, even when no one else is watching. Especially when no one else is watching. The applause started slowly. Catherine Morrison first, then Professor Chen, then Lydia. It built quickly after that, filling the ballroom with a sound that felt less like celebration and more like solidarity. Hannah waited for it to quiet, then continued. Tonight's program is about Caldwell Global's future, about the projects we're planning, the communities we're investing in. She smiled slightly. I'll be part of that future. I'm joining the company officially as Senior Director of Strategic Development, working directly with the Urban Initiatives team. More applause, genuine this time, excited. But I want my first act in that role to be different than you might expect. I want to invite everyone here, regardless of title, regardless of tenure, to consider the foundations you're building. In your work, in your relationships, in the image you present versus the character you practice when no one's evaluating you. She paused. Because buildings can be renovated, companies can pivot. But if you've built your life on the foundation of making others small, so you can feel big, eventually that foundation will fail. She stepped back from the podium slightly. Richard will continue with tonight's program. Thank you for your attention. And for anyone who's ever felt dismissed, diminished, or defined by someone else's insecurity, you're seen. You matter. And your dignity isn't determined by whether others choose to recognize it. The applause this time was thunderous. People stood first, a few, then dozens, then the entire room. A standing ovation not just for her words, but for the courage behind them, for the grace with which she delivered a devastating message without raising her voice or naming names. Well, without naming names explicitly. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Hannah descended from the stage with the same composure she'd shown all evening. Richard met her at the bottom, embracing her tightly, whispering something in her ear that made her nod. As she walked back through the ballroom, people reached out to touch her arm, to congratulate her, to introduce themselves properly. Catherine hugged her. Professor Chen beamed. Lydia promised to call next week. And Jonathan stood alone near their table, watching his wife, the woman he thought he knew, the woman he'd reduced to cleaner, receive the recognition and respect he'd been desperately chasing all evening. She'd had it all along. She'd always had it. He just hadn't bothered to ask. Hannah found Jonathan 30 minutes later in a hallway near the coat check, away from the ballroom's noise and celebration. He was leaning against the wall, his bow tie undone, his face the color of old paper. He looked up when she approached, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway was quiet marble floors, crown molding, the muffled sound of the gala continuing without them. A safe space for the conversation that could no longer be avoided. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonathan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah tilted her head slightly. "Tell you what? Don't." He stopped himself, recognizing the trap. "Any of it. That you're Richard's niece, that you have a master's degree from Columbia, that you've been consulting, that you," his hands gestured helplessly, "that you're someone." The last two words hung between them, more revealing than anything else. "I've always been someone, Jonathan," Hannah said quietly. "The question is why you never asked who." He stared at her. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" She moved closer. "In 7 years of marriage, did you ever ask about my education, my career before we met? What I wanted to do with my life beyond supporting yours? You said you were a research assistant? I was, at Columbia, for Professor Chen, while completing my master's degree in urban economics." She paused. "You never asked what I was researching. Never asked why I chose economics. Never asked if I had ambitions beyond our apartment." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You never brought it up." "I did," Hannah corrected gently. "Multiple times in our first year together. I told you about my thesis. I mentioned job interviews. I talked about papers I was working on." Her eyes held his. "You smiled and nodded and changed the subject to your work. Every time, until I stopped trying." "I don't remember." "I know you don't." There was no anger in her voice. Just sadness. "That's the problem. You didn't remember because it didn't matter to you. Because I was supposed to be your refuge from the corporate world, your simple, uncomplicated partner who made you feel grounded." She took a breath. "And I let you believe that because I loved you. Because I thought supporting your dreams was what partnership meant." "Hannah, why didn't I tell you I was Richard's niece? Because I wanted to see if you loved me for who I was or for what I could do for your career. And tonight, I got my answer." Jonathan flinched. "That's not I do love you." "You love the version of me you invented," Hannah said. "The one who exists to make you feel better about yourself. The one who stays small so you can feel big." She paused. "But you don't know me, Jonathan. You never asked about my family because you assumed I came from nowhere important. You never asked about my education because you assumed I had nothing worth discussing. You never asked about my career because you assumed I'd given it up for you willingly, gratefully. I didn't assume. You introduced me as your cleaner tonight," Hannah said, and finally there was emotion in her voice. Not anger, something deeper. "In a room full of people, you reduced 7 years of marriage to, 'She helps keep my place clean.' And when I spoke with people, when they found me interesting, you told me to stop drawing attention. To let you shine. To be smaller." Tears were forming in Jonathan's eyes. "I was nervous. I was trying to make a good impression. By making me disappear," Hannah finished. "By erasing me so completely that Richard Caldwell, my uncle, didn't even know I was married. Because I kept our relationship private to protect you from exactly this situation." She laughed without humor. "I gave you anonymity, and you used it to pretend I was nothing." "Hannah, please." He reached for her hand. She stepped back. "No." The word was quiet but absolute. "I asked you once, years ago, what you loved about me," she continued. "Do you remember what you said?" Jonathan's face showed he didn't. You said I was peaceful, uncomplicated, that being with me felt like coming home after a long day. She smiled sadly. You loved me for making you comfortable, for asking nothing of you, for being content to exist in your orbit rather than having my own. That's not. Love without respect becomes permission, Jonathan, Hannah said, and the sentence landed with weight. Permission to dismiss, to diminish, to decide that your comfort matters more than my dignity. I do respect you. You respect the idea of me, she corrected. The supportive wife, the calm presence, the woman who doesn't complicate your ambitions. She held his gaze. But you've never respected me enough to learn who I actually am, to ask what I want, to consider that my dreams might be as important as yours. Silence filled the hallway. Down the corridor, the gala continued music, laughter, celebration. Here, in this marble space, a marriage was ending. Not loudly, but with the quiet finality of foundations crumbling. What do you want me to do? Jonathan asked, desperation creeping into his voice. I want you to understand why it's broken, Hannah said. Not so you can fix it with me, but so you don't do it to the next person who loves you. Next person, Hannah. No, we can work through this. I'll do better. You'll change? She asked. You'll suddenly see me? You'll magically develop respect for who I am instead of who you need me to be? She shook her head. Change happens slowly, Jonathan, through years of work and self-reflection and genuinely uncomfortable growth. And it doesn't happen because you got caught. It happens because you want to become someone different. I do want. You want to undo tonight? Hannah interrupted gently. You want to erase the humiliation. You want to restore the image you'd built. That's not the same as wanting to change who you are. She moved toward the coat check, where her simple black jacket hung among hundreds of expensive evening coats. Jonathan followed her, his movements uncertain. Where will you go? He asked. Uncle Richard has an apartment in the city. I'll stay there tonight. She collected her jacket, sliding it on. Tomorrow I'll arrange to collect my things. Hannah, please. She turned to face him one last time. I loved you, Jonathan. I really did. I loved the man I thought you could become. The man you showed me in our early years when your guard was down. But you loved the idea of me, and you can't build a marriage on that foundation. I can change, he said, tears now openly falling. I can learn to see you, to respect you, to be better. Maybe, Hannah agreed. Maybe you can, but not with me, because every time you look at me now, you'll remember tonight. Remember being exposed. She smiled sadly. And I can't be your motivation for growth, Jonathan. That has to come from you, for you. She walked toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Hannah, he called out one last time. She paused but didn't turn around. Why didn't you ask? She said, repeating his own question back to him. In 7 years, why didn't you ask who I really was? She didn't wait for an answer. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. And Jonathan Reed stood alone in an empty hallway, surrounded by wealth and success and status that suddenly meant absolutely nothing. 6 months later, Jonathan Reed sat in a therapist's office in Murray Hill, staring at his hands while Dr. Patricia Williams waited patiently. She was right, he said finally, about all of it. Tell me, Dr. Williams prompted. I didn't know her. The admission still hurt. I was married to her for 7 years, and I didn't know basic facts about her life, her education, her family, her career. He laughed bitterly. I knew she liked classical music and made excellent pasta, but I didn't know she'd published research papers. I didn't know she was Richard Caldwell's niece. I didn't know she'd turned down teaching positions. Why didn't you know those things? Because I never asked. The words were easier now, after months of practice. Because I assumed she was content just being my wife. Because I needed her to be simple so I could feel complicated. Because, he stopped. Because her being small made me feel big. Dr. Williams made a note. And how do you feel about that now? Ashamed, Jonathan said immediately. Disgusted with myself. Angry that it took public humiliation to see what I'd been doing. He looked up, but also grateful. Because if that night hadn't happened, I might have continued that pattern forever. The pattern of using people to manage my own insecurity, Jonathan finished, making others smaller to feel bigger, building my image by erasing theirs. The work had been brutal. Therapy twice a week, journaling, actually reading books about emotional intelligence instead of just business strategy. Confronting the fact that his entire adult life had been a performance designed to mask the inadequacy he'd felt since childhood. At Caldwell Global, the aftermath had been swift. Monday morning, he'd been called to HR. Not fired, the company was too professional for that, but effectively demoted. Removed from the Riverside project, reassigned to a junior analysis team. His office relocated to a smaller space. The social fallout was worse. People who'd been friendly now kept their distance. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. He'd become a cautionary tale, a whispered warning. Did you hear about Reed? Introduced his own wife as his housekeeper. Turns out she's Caldwell's niece. Had a whole career he knew nothing about. Can you imagine being that blind? For the first 2 months, Jonathan had been defensive, had constructed elaborate justifications, had told himself he'd been under pressure, that anyone would have made the same mistake. But slowly, painfully, the defenses had crumbled. Because Hannah had told him, not about Richard specifically, but about herself. She'd tried to share her world, and he'd systematically dismissed every attempt because it didn't serve his narrative. I saw her last week, Jonathan said now, at a company presentation. She was leading it, the Sustainable Development Initiative Richard mentioned at the gala. She was brilliant, confident, completely in command. How did that feel? Like meeting someone for the first time, Jonathan admitted. Like seeing who she'd always been, underneath the version I'd invented. He paused. She nodded at me when it was over. Professional, polite, like I was a colleague she vaguely recognized. Were you hoping for more? No, Jonathan said, and meant it. I don't deserve more. She's moved on. She's thriving. And he gestured vaguely. I'm learning to be someone different. Someone who doesn't need others to be small. The work was ongoing. Learning to value people for who they were, not what they could do for him. Learning to manage his own insecurity without externalizing it. Learning that respect wasn't something you performed in public but practiced in private. It was humbling work. Unglamorous. No one applauded his growth. There were no galas for becoming a decent human being. Which, Dr. Williams kept reminding him, was exactly the point. Real change happens in ordinary moments, she'd said. In how you treat the barista who makes your coffee, in whether you listen when someone speaks, or just wait for your turn to talk. In whether you need to be the smartest person in the room, or can appreciate others' intelligence. Jonathan had started noticing those moments, started catching himself before interrupting, started asking questions instead of making statements. It was exhausting, but it was also freeing. One Saturday afternoon, he ran into Hannah at a coffee shop near Columbia. She was sitting alone with a stack of papers, red pen in hand, making notes in margins. He almost walked past. But something, maybe therapy, maybe genuine growth, maybe just the need to acknowledge what he'd learned, made him stop. Hannah. She looked up. Jonathan? I'm sorry, he said. I know I've said it before, but I wanted to say it again, without trying to explain or justify. Just I'm sorry. She studied him for a moment. Thank you. He nodded, preparing to leave. Jonathan, she said. He turned back. Are you doing okay? The question caught him off guard. After everything, she was asking if he was okay. The grace of it nearly broke him. I'm working on it, he said honestly. Therapy, trying to understand why I did what I did, why I couldn't see you. Hannah's expression softened slightly. That's good. That's important work. It doesn't fix anything, he said. I know that. I want you to know I'm trying to become someone different. Not for you, not to win you back, but because what happened that night showed me who I'd become, and I didn't like it. She nodded slowly. Growth is hard. Yeah, he smiled sadly. It really is. They stood in silence for a moment. Two people who'd been married, who'd shared a life, who were now strangers learning to recognize each other. I saw your presentation last week, Jonathan said. The Sustainable Development Initiative. It was brilliant. Thank you. You're doing exactly what you were meant to do, he continued. And I'm sorry I ever made you feel like you should be smaller than that. Hannah's eyes glistened slightly, but her voice remained steady. I appreciate that. She paused. I hope you figure out who you're meant to be, Jonathan, without needing to diminish anyone else to get there. Me too, he said. He left the coffee shop and walked through the city, watching people move past each one carrying their own insecurities, their own struggles, their own stories he'd never know unless he bothered to ask. His phone buzzed with a work email. A colleague asking for help with a project. The old Jonathan would have jumped at the chance to prove his value. The new Jonathan, the one still forming, still learning, read it carefully, and responded with genuine assistance instead of performance. It was a small moment, unremarkable. No one would write articles about his growth, but it mattered. That night, Jonathan sat in his smaller apartment, the one he'd moved to after Hannah left, the one that was comfortable but not impressive, and wrote in his journal, "What I learned today, dignity isn't about status, it's about recognizing the humanity in others and honoring it, even when it costs you something, even when no one's watching." Hannah was right. Love without respect becomes permission. Permission to erase, permission to diminish, permission to build yourself up by tearing others down. I'm learning to build differently now. Slowly, without applause, without recognition. Not because I'm hoping she'll see, but because I need to see myself differently. He closed the journal and looked around his small apartment. No marble floors, no impressive views, no image to maintain. Just space to become someone better. Someone who asked questions instead of making assumptions. Someone who valued people for who they were, not what they could do for him. Someone who understood that true power didn't announce itself, and real respect was practiced in private. The man who'd walked into that gala 6 months ago, desperate to be seen by people who didn't matter, desperate to build an image that wasn't real, that man was gone. And in his place was someone quieter, humbler, still flawed, still learning, still making mistakes. But learning to make different ones. Learning that the most important question wasn't, how do I look to others? But, who am I when no one's watching? The answer to that question, Jonathan was learning, was everything. Epilogue. 2 years later. Hannah Caldwell stood at the front of a Columbia lecture hall, addressing 200 graduate students about urban development economics. Her presentation was brilliant, data-driven, socially conscious, challenging conventional wisdom. In the back row, Professor Chen watched with obvious pride. After the lecture, a young woman approached with questions about balancing career ambitions with personal relationships. Hannah listened carefully, then answered with hard-won wisdom. "The right partnership doesn't require you to be smaller," she said. "It celebrates who you are and encourages you to become who you're meant to be. And if someone needs you to diminish yourself so they can feel bigger, that's not love. That's insecurity pretending to be love." The student nodded, taking notes. "But remember," Hannah continued, "you teach people how to treat you by allowing erasure, by staying silent when you should speak." She smiled gently. "Your dignity isn't up for negotiation. Ever." Across the city, Jonathan Reed was leading a small team meeting at Caldwell Global. He was still in analysis, still junior despite 2 years of solid work. But something had shifted in how he approached the role. He listened more than he spoke. He credited others' ideas explicitly. When a younger colleague offered a brilliant insight, he made sure everyone in the room knew where it came from. It wasn't glamorous. It wouldn't make him a director, but it was honest. After the meeting, that colleague, a woman named Sophia, who reminded him slightly of Hannah, stopped him. "Thank you for highlighting my work today," she said. "You did the work," Jonathan replied. "I just made sure people heard you." Sophia smiled. "A lot of men in this company wouldn't do that." "I used to be one of them," Jonathan admitted. "Took a hard lesson to learn better." He didn't elaborate, didn't tell her about the gala, or the humiliation, or the marriage that had ended, because he'd been too insecure to recognize the extraordinary woman beside him. That story was his to carry, not to weaponize as evidence of growth. Real growth happened quietly, in ordinary moments, when no one was keeping score. And both Jonathan and Hannah, in their separate lives, were learning the same lesson that night had taught them. Power that needs to announce itself isn't power. Respect that's only performed publicly isn't respect. And dignity, real dignity, is something you practice first with yourself, then extend to others, regardless of whether it benefits you. Because buildings could be torn down and rebuilt. Careers could pivot and recover. But foundations mattered. And if the foundation wasn't built on truth, respect, and genuine recognition of each other's humanity, eventually, inevitably, everything else would collapse. Better to build slowly, honestly, with nothing to prove to anyone but yourself. That was the lesson. And both of them, finally, had learned it.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Subscribe, like, and click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.